Okay, thank you. 100 years since Freud's group psychology, challenges for groups in the 21st century. Cosmin Chita from Romania, Switzerland. Cosmin, where are you? Oh, here. And I, Carla Penna from Brazil, in association with David Glynn, president of the Group Analytic Society International, which might be here, and Lindy Walton, chair of the scientific committee, are pleased to welcome you to the 46th Autumn Workshop. This year, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of Freud's Psychologie und ich Analyse, it is my German, translated into English as Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. To delve into the topic, we are excited to present an international staff of colleagues to whom we are grateful for accepting our invitation. Today, we begin with lectures delivered by Stephen Frosh, professor of psychosocial studies at Birkbeck University of London, and Dieter Nitzgen, psychoanalyst and group analyst from D3G from Germany. As large group conveners, we rely on the expertise of Gerda Winter from Denmark and Earl Hopper from UK. Tomorrow, Marina Mojovic from Serbia will host a session on social dreaming matrix, followed by discussions in small groups convened by Alice Mulasso and Alfonso Doria from Italy, Anka Di Troy from Israel, Anneli Bittner from Germany, Athena Hatsulis from Greece, Carmen O'Leary from Spain and UK, and Mike Tate from the UK, Dale Goodby and Martha Gilmore from the US, Dominique Leopardi from Switzerland, Helga Felsberger from Austria, Mary Sprang from Ireland, Switzerland, Mario Davi from Portugal, Paul Bernier from Sweden, and Stefan Sedovina from Serbia. We are grateful to Marlene Thyssen for her painting. She offered her painting for the flyer, and to Stefan Trojevic and Julia Porteras for their technical support. In this event, I think we as well would like to pay tribute to the memory of our dearest Malcolm Pines. Phenomena involving large numbers of persons have permeated history for centuries in the forms of mobs, crowds, masses, riots, and other experiences in which people shared collective beliefs. From the earliest recorded cases, for example, the dancing plague in Strasbourg, the French revolutions, mobs, the Luddite uprisings in England, and crowd manifestations in the 19th century France, several hypotheses have been formulated to explain people's unexpected behavior in different social formations. By the end of the 19th century, in the clash between liberal and conservative forces, new disciplines such as sociology, psychology, and criminology paved the way for the birth of the study of crowd psychology through Tarde and Le Bon in France, and Lombroso and Siguelle in Italy. The characterization of crowds as irrational, savage, and pathological prevailed in the conservative thinking of the 19th century scholars. Le Bon was the most important of them. His works have been published in many languages and read by totalitarian politicians like Mussolini and Hitler, and by a democrat like de Gaulle. Le Bon's talent seems to be linked to his ability to capture and translate into words the zeitgeist of his time, that is, the social situation, fears, and aspirations characteristic of the late 19th century. Theories about social hierarchies, race, and lower forms of evolution as women, savages, and children shaped his ideas. Le Bon imported from Salpêtrière and Nancy schools of medicine the concepts of imitation, suggestion, hypnosis, and contagion to discuss crowd psychology. He was convinced that the 19th century heralded the advent of a new era, the era of crowds. In the 20th century, at the dawn of mass society, with the emergence of mass men portrayed by Ortega y Gasset, the individuals were transformed into atomized masses, fascinated by the illusory power of their leaders. Produced just after the World War I, when Freud was disillusioned with the achievements of civilization and enduring personal hardships, for instance, the loss of his daughter Sophie to the Spanish flu, he wrote Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. The book transformed the views that used to give importance to the hypnotic suggestive futures of crowds, replacing them with unconscious processes, identifications, libidinal ties, and ideal agencies. Freud's mass psychology, together with the traumatic social, historical, and political events of the early 20th century, foreshadowed the way authoritarian leaders would influence and rule the masses. Concerns with collective behavior thus turned into a need to find ways to control and govern the masses. Therefore, what was feared in the 19th century began to manipulate it, control it, and docile, using a Foucaultian word, in the 20th century. From this perspective, it seems that the solution for mass rebellion depended mainly on the knowledge of its psychology. Freud's essay challenged the opposition between individual and social psychology, confirming the idea that individual psychology is connected to the context in which an individual is embedded. Freud's work on the masses highlights the link that binds the individual and the social and necessarily involves the other as a model, as an object, as a helper, as an opponent. Freud fired a fatal shot at modern dichotomies that ignored the interdependencies between individual and society relations, as Norbert Elias explored in process sociology. This view remained overshadowed for decades in classic psychoanalysis. However, it was active in the 1920s and the 1930s in Freudo-Marxist thinking, contributing to the Frankfurt School's studies on fascism, demagogic propaganda, and authoritarian personality from then on. It fostered the creation of critical analysis to understand collective behaviors and totalitarianism as a break on forms of oppression and voluntary servitude, in allusion to La Boétie. Freud and mass psychology contributed to group analytic roots as well. While still living in Germany, Fuchs was in contact with Freudo-Marxist ideas. In the 1930s, he joined the Frankfurt Psychoanalytic Institute. Though not a member of the Institute for Social Research, Fuchs was geographically and intellectually close to the cooperation between both institutes. Sabine Hotte from Frankfurt reports that Fuchs discussed Freud's essay on mass psychology with Carla and Henrik Menck, the founders of the Institute of Social Research, in a seminar in 1932, in the summer of 1932, just before moving to England. So they were holding this seminar during the summer, and Fuchs moved to England in 1932 in April. And Karl Landauer had his passport seized in the beginning of this year. So this seminar that the three of them were holding together was interrupted abruptly because we know that Landauer passed away in Bergen-Belsen in 1945. Years later, in 1975, while discussing large groups, Fuchs warned about the conductor's awareness of the power of his or her suggestive influence, reminding the conductor to resist the illusion of becoming the leader of the group instead of just leading it. Fuchs' words are a clear reference to the illusory power of mass leaders highlighted by Freud in 1921. For Georges Saint-Preux, Freud's work on mass psychology was fundamental for the understanding and development of 20th century history and 20th century thinking. The thesis defended by Hannah Arendt, Elias, Canetti, Adorno, and Sartre would never have been formulated without Freud's work on the masses. However, the 20th century had to run its course so that the work on masses could enjoy its deserved status. Through a contemporary look that bets on the expansion of transdisciplinary research in collective formations, Eugène Henriquez in France writes, "The message of this book could only be denied or concealed. The time of this illusion had to come so that this lucid test could finally be read without taking sides and be considered for what it is, the introductory, fascinating, obscure, and uncertain test of a new discipline. Psychosociology in France, of course, but I will say group analysis in Brazil and in Europe and other countries, but also the science of the study of groups, organizations, and institutions. Today, Freud's contribution to mass psychology are still opening new avenues of inquiry in the study of group formations, especially if we consider the role of helplessness and illusion. If, on the one hand, the narcissism of minor differences provides an amalgam for the illusion of group cohesion, on the other hand, it encourages projections, exclusion, and scapegoating processes. Although an optimal degree of cohesion, as defined by the metaphor used by Freud of the Schopenhauer's porcupine, facilitates life in society, the idea seems almost a daydream when we consider the prevalence of incohesion processes in the last century, and now with the outburst of COVID-19, a crowd disease. We should not forget that collective formations, be they ephemeral crowds or organized group, gather around a leader or not, because we should have mass formations without a leader. It can be extremely dangerous as well. Do not differ in their relationship with illusion. Although Freud has privileged the psychological point of view in his analysis of the masses, almost ignoring the biological, the social, and anthropological tenets, the main idea put forward in 1921 was that of illusion. In this sense, Freud quoted Le Bon. Groups, and I might say masses, have never thirsted after truth. They demand illusions and cannot do without them. We start today our workshop reflections with Stephen Frosh and Dieter Nitzgen presentations, followed by 20 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you very much. And may I introduce you, Professor Stephen Frosh.
Thank you, Carla. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay, I just want to try and share the screen. And let me just check. So again, can you see my screen now? You should just see a title that says Mass Psychology and Psychosocial Assemblies. Good. Okay, great. It's really nice to be here. It's lovely to see people who I haven't seen for quite a while. And one day maybe we'll even see each other in person again. I'm sitting here with two computers and wires everywhere, so I will do my best not to get too muddled. This talk is called Mass Psychology and Psychosocial Assemblies. The first section is called the psychosocial subject. Freud's mass psychology and the analysis of the I, known in the standard edition as group psychology and the analysis of the ego, begins with a famous and unexpected paragraph. The contrast between individual psychology and social or group psychology, which at first glance may seem to be full of significance, loses a great deal of its sharpness when it's examined more closely. It's true that individual psychology is concerned with the individual man and explores the paths by which he seeks to find satisfaction for his instinctual impulses, but only rarely and under certain exceptional conditions is individual psychology in a position to disregard the relations of this individual to others. In the individual's mental life, someone else is invariably involved as a model, as an object, as a helper, as an opponent. And so from the very first, individual psychology, in this extended but entirely justifiable sense of the words, is at the same time social psychology as well. Well, we could be reading Winnicott here. Freud is usually cast as a closed system thinker, his focus firmly on what he calls in this passage, individual psychology. His account of human motivations firmly rooted in their internal world. Indeed, it could be argued that his system becomes more individualistic and biological as he ages. The death drive, newly invented or discovered in Beyond the Pleasure Principle just a year or so earlier, imagines much of the source of life's energy as coming from universal drives embedded in each of us individually. And even his great social texts of later years, notably Civilization and its Discontents, mark out the source of human struggle as repression of these drives by a society set against the individual. Yet here in group psychology, he might be writing, there is no such thing as a baby. He says there is no individual without someone else as a model, as an object, as a helper, as an opponent. And individual psychology is first and foremost, or at least at the same time, social psychology as well. This is surely enough to establish Freud as a psychosocial thinker, in this book of his at least, if we understand psychosocial studies to be concerned with the ways in which psychic and social processes demand to be understood as implicated in each other, as mutually constitutive and co-produced, and hence always to be read together. For Freud, this was perhaps a lightly held or precarious conviction, always likely to give way to his relentless interest in building up an understanding of the individual unconscious. However, we should note how, from Totem and Taboo onwards, Freud was intrigued by the social or civilizational origins of psychic life, including patterns of Darwinian and Lamarckian inheritance, and a speculative notion of prehistorical primal hordes that finds its place in the group psychology book and in his last major work, Moses and Monotheism. All this simply means, to coin a phrase, that psychosocial Freud really existed. As he wrote in the continuation of the opening quotation, all the relations which have hitherto been the chief subject of psychoanalytic research may claim to be considered as social phenomena. 100 years later, much has changed in the world, especially in relation to technology and globalization, yet much remains the same. Wars continue. People are displaced in huge numbers. Women are still attacked daily. Sexual and gender pluralities still produce moral panics, as well as deep hatred. Inequality is pervasive, and racism is still the most tangible most destructive, and most widespread force running through societies everywhere. Even anti-Semitism, which was a defining feature of Freud's time and which one might have hoped had been eradicated along with the Third Reich, has been fully resurrected and made respectable again. And anti-Black racism in its various formations, the legacy of colonialism and slavery, is rife. Black Lives Matter and the distribution of suffering under COVID have demonstrated this clearly. For example, we've seen in the pandemic how some lives have been made to matter more than others, how some populations are disposable in the interests of economic and political concerns that derive from failures of care, and in some countries, Brazil is the exemplar, a masculinist denialism that has the flavor of murderous psychopathy. COVID may be a biological entity, but its spread was caused by globalization as well as social neglect, and its impact is mediated by social structures. This unequal distribution of suffering, intimately tied up with poverty and race, shows yet again how much health and illness are socially structured. What affects us as individuals is not so much what comes from within, but what bears on us from outside. Once again, however, the distinction between inside and out is a false one. The virus is part of a worldwide ecology that infiltrates each of us, affecting our dreams and nightmares, our inner anxieties, and our relationships with others, who we care for and who we overlook. The psychosocial subject, as I would term all of us, is a nodal point at which these forces meet. The inner structures of prejudicial thought and the external structures of racism being amongst the most cogent examples. Part 2, Assemblies. Almost 100 years after group psychology and the analysis of the ego, here is Judith Butler's 2015 formulation of how the individual is constituted by and in the social. Picking up on the neoliberal antagonism towards interdependency, which we have seen both in the UK and in the USA as an attack on welfare, as if welfare is something to be despised, Butler wants to reassert the importance of alliance between different people and groups within the context of mass movements that she calls assemblies. There is a lot that might be said about this terminology, but for the moment note how she links the idea of an assembly between bodies, for instance a mass demonstration, and the kinds of assembly that make up our subjective existence. The quotation is characteristically dense. Butler is our most subtle thinker, radical yet cautious about her lines of argument. Sorry. Apologies for that. Try again. Can you still hear me all right?
You don't change your slides.
The quotation, can you still see my slides?
No, it's just the first one still.
Yes, that's fine. I'm about to move. That's fine.
Okay. Sorry.
The quotation I'm going to give is characteristically dense. Butler is our most subtle thinker, radical yet cautious about her lines of argument, but I will try to parse it in a moment. What I'm calling alliance, she says, is not only a future social form. Sometimes it's latent, or sometimes it actually is the structure of our own subject formation, as when alliance happens within a single subject, when it's possible to say, I am myself an alliance, or I ally with myself on various cultural vicissitudes. Such a view, which implicates social relationality in the first person pronoun, challenges us to grasp the insufficiency of identitarian ontologies for thinking about the problem of alliance. For the point is not that I'm a collection of identities, but that I am already an assembly, even a general assembly or an assemblage. There's a lot in this quotation, and it's a difficult one, relying on a context that I've not been able to give in detail for its full sense. But the point to dwell on here is Butler's assertion of the state of the subject as the collection of internal alliances between different forms of precarity, by which she conveys the idea that each of us is constituted through vulnerabilities that are inherently social. We do not form ourselves out of a set of firm identities, she argues, but rather out of an alliance of minoritized statuses. This is of a piece with her earlier work on the relationship between vulnerability and violence, and the question of how we can form ourselves non-violently out of the vulnerability in which we are all mired. It also has echoes, at least, of the idea that we are constituted by our objects, that our supposedly inner lives are made up of patterns of internalization and identification derived from and feeding back into our social relationships. We make alliances, Butler seems to be saying here, both internally between aspects of our subjecthood and externally in the ways in which we link across our different groupings, sexuality, gender, race, and so on, and in the patterns of assembly that make up our groupishness and sometimes spill over into the streets. From here, of course, it's easy to see how the supposedly inner world of our subjective life is linked, is part of the political world that grounds and structures our precarious being. Vulnerability and violence. Groups, masses, and assemblies, these continue to be central to social life, with the imbrication of social and personal that I've been describing under the heading psychosocial to the constitution of the subject itself. Jacqueline Rose, referencing group or mass psychology, glosses the situation like this. Sorry, not like that. Like this. We only exist through the others who make up the storehouse of the mind, models in our first tentative steps towards identity, objects of our desires, helpers and foes. The mind is a palimpsest in which the trace of these figures will jostle and rearrange themselves forevermore. From the very earliest moments of our lives, since without the rudiments of contact the infant will not survive, we are peopled by others. Our psyche is a social space. The power of this idea is to break down the social individual divide, as I've already suggested, but it's also to make the mind a mass phenomenon. This is not an analogy with groups, but a critique of any approach, whether psychoanalytic or otherwise, that separates each of us from others at any level of our consciousness. If we were to translate this into Levinasian terms, for example, we might call it an assertion of the pre-ontological nature of human relationality. The demand of the other comes before any cognition, any experience or reasoning. But it seems that this is the ethical implication of primary relationality, not necessarily its source, which in fact lies in the ubiquity of human vulnerability. Butler makes a crucial link here between this vulnerability, which exudes from the fact of infantile dependence, and violence. She comments, thus, in the face of the other, one is aware of the vulnerability of that other, that the other's life is precarious, exposed, and subject to death. But one is also aware of one's own violence, one's own capacity to cause the death of the other, to be the agent who could expose the other to his dissolution. I should say that picture is not a very old-looking Judith Butler, it's Levinas, who she's drawing on here. This is the violence drawn out in the subject by the precariousness of the other. Why does it occur? In part because of the reciprocal vulnerability of each one of us when we actually look seriously at what and who it is that we need to help us to survive. Our vulnerability makes us subject to the violence of the other and also incites a response which can be towards that other, the ethical response that fulfills the Levinasian charge, or against it. Butler again. It's crucial to distinguish, he says, between A, that injured and rageful subject who gives moral legitimacy to rageful and injurious conduct, thus transmuting aggression into virtue, and B, that injured and rageful subject who nevertheless seeks to limit the injury that she or he causes, and could do so only through an active struggle with and against aggression. The first involves a moralization of the subject that disavows the violence it inflicts, while the latter necessitates a moral struggle with the idea of non-violence in the midst of an encounter with social violence as well as with one's own aggression. Our fragility can lead us to export violence onto the other, including the next generation as well as the supposed enemy. The challenge which Butler codes under non-violence is to understand that personal vulnerability and even suffering can be a source of realization of the precarity of all human subjects, and to use her more recent vocabulary, their potential grievability, which means to say, acknowledgement of their mattering and their entitlement to continuing care. This, of course, occurs within awareness of the structures of inequality and oppression, hence why the slogan and movement is Black Lives Matter and not All Lives Matter. It's also a key issue in thinking about groups, as it relates to what are usually thought of as boundary conditions, but can be considered the core dynamic question, that of inclusion and exclusion. Managing the mass. The centrality of questions of the mass and the group is hardly news. As Carla Penna describes in her new book, from the mid-19th century onwards, moral panics about the irrationality and bestiality of crowds fueled anxious attempts to theorize and control them. Leadership became both an exalted means of control and a feared channel for both fascism and revolutionary insurrection. And later on, with the advent of critical theory and the attempt to understand Nazism as a mass phenomenon, issues surrounding the influence of ideology and propaganda on masses became central. Carla summarizes, today, we are no longer involved in the threats of 19th century crowd psychology or exclusively immersed in the classical model of 20th century mass psychology. We're dealing with new interdependencies in the sociocultural and political spheres, in which 20th century traumatic legacies and their psychosocial consequences for the social systems play an important role. We are also facing the delicate question of how revolutionary assemblies can be co-opted to reactionary ends, how right-wing populism can infiltrate groups who have forgotten the destructive force of fascism, and how despite this, something can happen to spark a mass into creativity and unleash the possibility of it being a medium for genuine change. Here is an extended example given by my ex-postdoctoral student, Raluca Soriano, in her powerful account of the Brazilian social uprising of 2013, before it all turned sour and the country ended up with a psychopathic demagogue as its president. On June 20th, 2013, more than 1 million people took to the streets in Rio de Janeiro. The crowd was in movement. It circulated in new and unpredictable ways. It flooded lateral streets, regrouped itself in the squares, only to return to the avenue. It constituted new flows, the flows of large gatherings. They were circular, oblique, spiraling. At a certain point, while advancing on the Avenida Presidente Vargas, the protesters in the front lines encountered the first police barricade, heard the first explosions of the bomba de efeito moral, bombs with moral effect, as they're called in Brazil, and felt the tear gas in their nostrils. The density of the crowd at that time was immense. Encountering the barricade produced a massive agglomeration of bodies. In the moment when the first explosions were heard and the gas sensed, the tension rose, and instantly multiple threads of protesters started circulating in the same space, with body-to-body friction, as some decided to advance, while some wanted to return. This powerful new urban traffic of mass protests was accumulating in terms of seconds toward a general panic and toward a catastrophe in which people start running and risk trampling each other. In this moment of heightened tension, a rhythmic event occurs. One of the protesters stands up on a cement block, raises his long arms obliquely over the crowd, moving them slowly up and down, and utters in a strong, deep voice, in attunement with his movements, sem correr, sem correr, sem correr. No running, no running, no running. The repeated chants pause the collective body, which then lets itself be modulated by the containing voice movement. The erratic threads of people who were prepared to run away in panic, slow down, and return to more orderly patterns. The collective does not collapse into a set of individuals, but maintains its synchronized modulations. Luca Soriano understands this extraordinary moment as an instance of a kind of containment. She says someone is able to contain the movement of a crowd of tens of thousands and their despair in reliving scenes of violence that transport them to the times of the military dictatorship. It's a containment in which the rhythmicity of the bodily action maintains and recreates a social body, or indeed a new element of the social that resists destruction and promotes what she calls a new complex of subjectification. She writes, the oblique line drawn by the arms travels away from the individual body to contain and modulate the rhythm of the socius. In so doing, it creates a new socius, a new complex of subjectification. The collective has incorporated the obliqueness of care. A new semiotic conjunction becomes conceivable across arms, eyes, voice, moving, crowd. In this way, a certain act that's both in tune with the crowd and has an integrating enactment of symbolic leadership offers protection and calmness and a way forward for a mode of progressive crowd control. Quoting Ferenczi, Soriano comments, the organism begins to think. Luca herself is most interested in understanding this particular mass phenomenon as an instance of Ferenczian orphic care and a way of thinking through psychic fragments, and her account of this is imaginative and persuasive. But for the moment, let's also think of it in terms of the way in which the boundaries of body and psyche dissolve. That is, a merging of the material, social, political, and personal in one mass that has a life of its own. This is quite a precise carving out of a space that might be called psychosocial, in its adherence to a kind of unity that dispenses with these convenient and self-serving categories, to explain that the division between individual and group is neither stable nor perspectival. The mass has a life of its own rhythm. The binary of individual social is a way perhaps of trying to deal with this, to ward it off. But something else is at stake, running through everything. This is not a matter of regression, the primary way of theorizing it in the 19th century. It's rather a recognition that a group, a mass, a crowd, all these entities that might be differentiated, and yet are usually run together, has a life, and that this life is an embodied one. The collective does not collapse into a collection of individuals, but maintains its synchronized modulations, as Soriano writes. This also refers back to Butler's claim that assemblies constitute the subject, that I am already an assembly, even a general assembly or an assemblage. The point here is that the distinction between individual and group falls away as assemblage becomes the pattern that runs through us all, rhizomatically, as the Deleuzians might say, making multiple the connections that we all have with elements of ourselves and others. Primitivity and the mass. Yet is this what groups offer and can be made to do? The idea of the group as irrational keeps returning, visible especially in the deep-rooted association between the mass and the primitive or savage. For example, Freud accepts to some extent the idea that groups promote regression and draws on a trope familiar from Totem and Taboo as he seeks to explain how people in the mass seem somehow to lose their minds. That's a picture of Le Bon, not of Freud, of course. Some of the mass's features, the weakness of intellectual ability, the lack of emotional restraint, the incapacity for moderation and delay, the inclination to exceed every limit in the expression of emotion and to work it off completely in the form of action. These and similar features, which we find so impressively described in Le Bon, show an unmistakable picture of a regression of mental activity to an earlier stage, such as we're not surprised to find among savages or children. I will not dwell on the associations of primitivity and savagery in psychoanalysis, and the way Freud uses the standard racist model in which supposedly savage peoples are conceptualized as children, a model that legitimizes colonialism as a civilizing mission, and of course covers over the depredations of imperialism. Greed and genuine savagery by the imperialists in the name of civilization was recognized as such by some even at the time, even as early as the 16th century, as George Macari shows in his recent history of xenophobia. Freud certainly uses this idea in group psychology, in particular when he returns to his just so hypothesis of the primal horde. We need to watch out for this, as when assumptions about group regression lead into a vision of collective societies as infantile and a developmentalist model of civilization as marked by increasing individuation, so that maturity is a matter of independence and thence of celebration of the individualized consumer. To be fairer to Freud, however, which is very important to be, he is a critic both of Le Bon's easy assumption of the primitivity of the mass and, ambiguously, of the primitive civilized distinction that he also employs. In a powerful PhD thesis supervised by Jacqueline Rose, actually Singh argues persuasively that Freud's use of various terms that all get translated as primitive or savage reveal a far more nuanced understanding of the mental process he is interested in than might appear from the English texts. Singh argues that Freud did indeed make a distinction between primitive and civilized, but the distance between the two is never fixed in his writing. In the very text where he collapses the two into each other, he also warns the reader against any such assimilation of the savage to the prehistoric. The intricacies of this are not essential here, only to note that reading them tempers my own previous view that Freud bought in unabashedly to the colonial reduction. However, what emerges even from a more preliminary examination of Freud's work on the primitive is how closely aligned this idea is to that of the unconscious, and hence how weak can be the division between the savage and the civilized. The unconscious runs through all of us. This is indeed one of the ways in which the apparent boundaries between and within subjects dissolve, as is recognized in the group analytic idea of the social unconscious. Singh comments on this that the primitive may occasionally be the fall guy in Freud's attempt to hold on to a progressivist view of civilization, but it cannot be done away with so easily. Psychoanalysis, Freud writes, dealing as it does with the unconscious, with problems of death and mourning, has itself become uncanny to many people. In saying this, he suggests an intimacy between the primitive and psychoanalysis. It's as though the primitive is the double of psychoanalysis. They come to occupy the same uncanny place. For Freud, even when aligning the group with the primal horde, something else is at play. Insofar as men, this is from the group analysis book, group psychology book, insofar as men are habitually under the sway of group formation, we recognize in it the survival of the primal horde. We must conclude that the psychology of groups is the oldest human psychology. What we have isolated as individual psychology by neglecting all traces of the group has only since come into prominence out of the old group psychology by a gradual process which may still perhaps be described as incomplete. Freud goes on immediately to qualify this by arguing that the leader of the primal horde was a genuine individual, not bound up in the libidinal ties and identifications that link each member of the group with one another in a horizontal fashion, but living outside the rule of the group. This means that individual and group psychology emerge at the same time. The leader is the individualized exception who makes the group possible. Even today, he writes, the members of a group stand in need of the illusion that they are equally and justly loved by their leader. But the leader himself need love no one else. He may be of a masterful nature, absolutely narcissistic, self-confident, and independent. But the point is a more general one. The unconscious runs through groups and individuals, patterning identifications and the combining of ego ideals in both vertical and horizontal relationships, making libidinal bonds the source of group alliances. It is not loss of boundaries that creates groups, but the structuring of relationships in certain ways, ways in which some bind together in love for each other and for a leader, and maximize these bonds through their exclusion of others. Freud summarizes each individual as a component part of numerous groups. He's bound by ties of identification in many directions, and he's built up his ego ideal upon the most various models. Each individual, therefore, has a share in numerous group minds, those of his race, of his class, of his creed, of his nationality, etc. And he can also raise himself above them to the extent of having a scrap of independence and originality. This is perhaps what's crucial for now. how it comes about that groups function in ways full of love and hate, and what can be done about this. Exclusions. Jacqueline Rose describes Freud's trajectory like this. From mass psychology to Moses the Man, his last major work, all Freud's writings on collective life share a question. What drives people to hatred? As if Freud had made two utterly interdependent discoveries that also threatened to cancel or wipe each other out, taking the whole world with them. No man is an island, you are the others who you are, but the mind is also its own worst enemy, and there is no link between individuals, no collective identity, which does not lead to war. The key issue here is how can one think of the ambivalence produced by the group or mass in relation to an ethic of non-violence? Are we limited to containment, or is it possible to consider a new form of radical sociality through this kind of material? The negative side of the formation of groups is easy to see, how groups bind together through processes of identification, but also of projection, in which, as Carla Penna points out, the narcissism of small differences becomes a vital concept. Preserving the group through projecting its antagonistic elements into the supposed outsider, one source clearly of xenophobia, is a strategy for maintaining the group itself in its illusory belief in its members and in its leaders, as politicians have always known. Why the obviousness of this tactic does not lead to them being found out by the group members, the populace, is a moot point, presumably answerable in terms relating the avoidance of precarity to the defensive maintenance of illusions of safety, or maybe a simple paranoid schizoid mechanism in which the appalled recognition of inner destructiveness is made a little more manageable by projecting it into the outside world, where a fantasy of dealing with it through the force of exclusion, or indeed literal force, can be entertained. This can happen at the level of the individual or of the group, if we can sustain that distinction. It's perhaps better thought of as a dynamic process, a mechanism of boundary formation that runs through life and can be seen in various manifestations hovering around the skin of the person and of groups and masses, all human formations, in fact. Freud's Fort Da template is instructive here. Built out of observations of the play of his grandchild, this out-in formation is one that comes not only to define psychoanalysis as a process of repetition, but also to evoke the interminable practices of marginalizing and assimilating that characterize groups, masses, and nations, and in Freud's time specifically invoked the position of Jews like himself, inside and out, always seductively invited, then viciously excluded, at one moment a citizen, at another not human at all. The terrors within the group are easy to find: rivalries, internecine conflict, ambition, wishes to displace leaders, fears of contamination. To link this back to group analysis, some time ago I was intrigued by thinking on the larger group, which seemed to focus on anxiety produced in group members by the dissolution of boundaries, anxiety that could be productive as well as frightening. Some accounts, however, noted that it is not necessarily just this identity loss that's felt as so threatening, but also the simple proximity of the other, now cast as the neighbor in the group, who could call into question one's own sense of separate being, and in particular could pose a threat by their too closeness. For instance, in a classic paper by Pierre Turquet, now over 50 years ago, notes how the individual member of a group needs to feel a sense of security in relation to the skin of the neighbor, a sense of connection with another who is close, but also separate, a connection that can make the subject feel real, as well as reassuringly in touch with others. The external boundary offered by the skin defends the subject against an ever-present threat of becoming other than himself, of being in some way altered, pressured, even diminished, as Turquet says. In the large group, however, there are many forces arrayed against the stability of the skin, which Turquet lists, using a vocabulary full of the sense of something being awry with the other, with the neighbor on whom the subject actually depends. In the large group, he writes, disruption of the skin of my neighbor boundary is an ever-present threat from the action of the centrifugal forces, which both cause the I to withdraw, but also place him relationally in increasingly idiosyncratic and isolated positions. Continuity with this skin of my neighbor is also in jeopardy because the large group raises many more problems about these neighbors. Where, who, when, what are they? This experience of search and questioning is further aggravated by the almost daily changes in their spatial positioning, at first near, then far, now in front, now behind, now on the left, now on the right, and so on. These repeated and shifting changes of position in space give rise to additional questions. Why these changes? In what way has my neighbor changed? Into what? Where has he gone? And so forth. Dependence upon a neighbor who is in important ways unknowable, who slips out of one's grasp and somehow through that becomes dangerous, Turkey lists violence as another major characteristic of the large group, suggests the preponderance of a sensation of persecution and anxiety, as regression occurs in the context of a lack of trust, and subjectivity comes to be premised on contact with someone who's not quite there. It emphasizes the mysterious nature of this neighbor and the questions this raises. This produces an experience of interruption and disruption explicitly annotated with the term threat. If this is a recognizable phenomenon in the large group, it's worth noting the very embodied description that Turkey offers, using the image of the skin of my neighbor. Continuity with the skin of my neighbor is ached for, but the disruption to the boundary between one skin and another is an ever-present threat. In a vision that seems redolent with ancient anti-Semitic tropes, the shape-shifting neighbor is not just next to one, but inside one, as a kind of invader. The neighbor is indeed someone too close, who gets under one's skin. This verbal formula is itself an acknowledgement of the interpenetrability of bodies within a psychic frame. Someone who invades our mind is imagined as within our skin. It's worth comparing this dystopian view of the bodily encounter with Butler's exploration of bodies coming together in the street as a mode of democratic insistence. To rethink the space of appearance in order to understand the power and effect of public demonstrations for our time, we will need to consider more closely the bodily dimensions of action, what the body requires, and what the body can do, especially when we must think about bodies together in a historical space that undergoes a historical transformation by virtue of their collective action. What holds them together there, and what are their conditions of persistence and of power in relation to their precarity and exposure? Bodies together, a return of the mass, present a demand for a kind of immediate pre-ontological recognition. Butler links this with precarity, with making vulnerable, a state of being that is resonant with Raluca Soriano's Brazilian illustration that I gave earlier. Bodies coming together in vulnerability and out of precarity, needing to express their hopes and fears, are a powerful statement of being, not that everyone is the same, but rather that everyone is forged in the same elemental, and binding together as a mass, as an assembly, is a way of giving expression to this. Final section, grievability. Of course, one problem with the mass then and now is to differentiate between the kind of massing that is progressive, enabling, and democratic, and the kind that resembles more the crowd of the 19th century and the fascist mass that for good reason dominated the imagination of the theorists of the mid-20th. When is a mass, an assembly, a force for good, and when is it a reactionary phenomenon? And what might govern the transformation of a mass from one state to another, as happened to some extent in Brazil, where the democratic protests of 2013 were co-opted into neo-fascist rallies and the near destruction of the democratic state. Here I think the question of exclusion comes back into play. For Butler, following Arendt, the question is one of rights-bearing. She writes that for Arendt, this is not a matter of finding the human dignity within each person, but rather of understanding the human as a relational and social being, one whose action depends upon equality and articulates the principle of equality. Indeed, there is no human in her view if there is no equality. No human can be human alone, and no human can be human without acting in concert with others and on conditions of equality. The bodies that assemble on the street do so in a spirit of equality that extends further than that assembly or mass itself. It includes those others who would be excluded by the forces of reaction. Indeed, the notion of the other has to disappear here, because it always presupposes a same. Here there is me, over there is you, the other to myself. The language of the other, which a while ago seemed to be a way of reaching out, we must recognize the other. Now, in the light of Black Lives Matter and the decolonizing movement, seems to be an exclusionary language in which the other is looked at as different, always at risk of ceasing to be included in the us, and hence of no longer being quite human. Something must be invoked in the assembly that breaks into the dynamics and politics of exclusion so that the so-called other, perhaps now genuinely best theorized as the neighbor, which is the language used by Turkey, becomes part of the mass and not just a recipient of unwanted projections. The assembly becomes sustainable by its ethical bonds, not just by a set of identifications premised on the binary of different and same. Butler gives us a language with which to think this ethical relationality in her notion of grievability, which has become central to much of her thinking, especially on resistance and non-violence. Grievability distinguishes between lives worth preserving and others that are discardable, those lives that would be grieved if they were lost, and those that do not seem to count. Grievability is not in itself a statement about grief, but rather about mattering in the sense of Black Lives Matter. To be grievable, Butler writes, is to be interpellated in such a way that you know that your life matters, that the loss of your life would matter, that your body is treated as one that should be able to live and thrive, whose precarity should be minimized, for which provisions for flourishing should be available. Yet these conditions do not hold for all people, and the inequality in grievability in the valuing of lives is deeply racialized. Butler discusses this in detail in relation to the killing of Black men in America, defined automatically within the racist phantasmagoria as posing a threat even when running away, in the unreported and mislabeled deaths of Black women, and in the contemporary European racism expressed in the willed deaths of thousands of migrants who have lost their lives in the Mediterranean, lives which are precisely, as she puts it, lives that are not deemed worthy of safeguarding. The perceptions here are not peculiarly psychoanalytic ones, but in The Force of Nonviolence, her 2020 book, Butler joins her account of grievability to psychoanalysis, giving Freud and Melanie Klein privileged positions. The latter is used in an evocative portrait of vulnerability to understand how grievability might be part of a process of reparation for the damage that one has done to others and for the damage done to oneself. What Butler points out about this is how reparation and guilt can be preemptive, how they can arise out of the wish not to do damage, or perhaps the knowledge that damage is very likely to be done, and then involve putting in place the conditions under which the life of the other, and hence one's own life, can be repaired, preserved, and protected in the light of that future and past damage. The vulnerability one feels, the hurt that has been done to one, the conditions under which social violence usually thrives, as it looks to project these hurts and vulnerabilities into minoritized others. These can also be the basis for a philosophy of ethics that takes the grievability of others as foundational, and so resists precisely that derogation, that disowning of precarity on which destructive social forces feed. What's being attempted here is a statement of how lives are made to matter and not to matter, and how this construction of grievability is distributed on racialized and gendered grounds. Alongside this is the development of an argument for contestation of violence that's forged out of a psychoanalytic sensitivity to the conditions in which our vulnerabilities might become links with others, rather than be translated into racist forms of repudiation. What Butler suggests is that these racialized and gendered forms of violence can be interpreted through the lens of vulnerability, and in this way can track the turning of the hurt received into the hurt inflicted. Our vulnerabilities make us sites for racist discarding of others and for the perpetuation of self-destructive inequalities and hatreds through this. The question is whether and how it might be possible to move from this reactive position to one in which the construction of others as grievable becomes a primary shared political concern, and one that does indeed not distinguish between different populations in terms of their racialized worth, and does not make the politics of exclusion the basis of social life. Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's so difficult that we cannot hear the people clapping their hands. So in the end, we will clap our hands. So thank you very much, Stephen. It was very, very, very important, and it will give us a lot of material to discuss during this workshop. Let's call now Dieter Nitzgen to present his paper. I will try to follow you, sharing your screen, so you can ask me when you want to start to share since the beginning.
Yes.
Yes. So please, I will.
First of all, let me start by saying, dear Carla, dear Cosmin, thank you for the invitation. My thanks also to the management committee as the third element in the background. Thank you very much. And now a retelling of the same story in a different mode, maybe. Freud's approach to mass psychology builds on the analysis on the individual ego. The first time he refers to such an analysis of the ego, interestingly, is in his paper on Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he speculated that instincts other than those of self-preservation operate in the ego, namely libidinal ones. However, he admitted that, unfortunately, the analysis of the ego has made so little headway that it is very difficult for us to do so. In the paper on mass psychology, it is in the paper on mass psychology where this conceptual lack is elaborated. However, the provisional status of the ego did not discourage and prevent Freud to posit his main point, as Stephen already quoted, namely that in the individual psychic life, other people usually must be considered as either models, helpers, or opponents, and thus, from the beginning, individual psychology is simultaneously group psychology, in this restricted but legitimated sense. Summarizing his arguments regarding mass formation, Freud wrote that the individual gives up his ego ideal and substitutes it for the group ideal as embodied in the leader. Theoretically, he argued, we are aware that what we have been able to contribute towards the explanation of the libidinal structure of groups leads back to the distinction between the ego and the ego ideal, and to the double kind of tie which makes this possible, identification and putting the object in the place of the ego itself, of the ego ideal. However, he added that the assumption of this kind of differentiating grade in the ego as a first step in an analysis of the ego must gradually establish its justification in the most various regions of psychology. It is noteworthy that in the original German text, Freud refers to this grade as a step within the ego, as eine Stufe im Ich, a spatial metaphor that is closer to architecture and certainly more evocative than the English translation of it. In any case, the elaboration of this step, level, or grade kept psychoanalysts busy for quite some time. First of all, Freud himself, who eventually came to differentiate the ego from the ego ideal and both from the superego. Moreover, it inspired Nürnberg, Lagache, and Lacan to distinguish the ego and the ideal ego, most notably in the form of the mirror image, as it was first presented by Lacan in Marienbad in 1936, and again in Zurich, where he spoke of the mirror stage as formative of the function of the eye. However, in the 1930s, there was another relevant reading of this step put forward by Robert Bell, a psychoanalyst whose early contributions are only rarely mentioned today. From a group analytic point of view, They are of interest, though, not only because of Welder's close personal and professional relationship with Fuchs, but also because they reveal important details concerning the politics of psychoanalysis before and after the outbreak of the Second World War, especially with regard to the controversial discussions between the Kleinian and the Freudian group within the British Psychoanalytical Society. After all, it was Welder who was chosen by the Viennese group to comment on Joan Riviere's paper on the genesis of psychical conference in earliest infancy, which actually started these discussions. In his autobiographical notes, Fuchs recollected the many hours he spent discussing the latest advances of psychoanalytic theory with his friend and colleague Robert Welder in Vienna in the late 1920s. Namely Freud's paper on Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and most probably also mass psychology and the analysis of the ego. However, it is quite likely that they also discussed Welder's forthcoming paper on the principle of multiple function, published in 1930, which was a major advance in the development of ego psychology. Here, Welder argued that each psychic act fulfills a multiple function with regard to the different tasks the ego is confronted with, according to Freud, namely to deal with the exigencies of the outer world, the id, and the superego, and also with regard with the repetition compulsion, which Welder conceived as an agency in its own right. Therefore, each psychic act is always overdetermined and has multiple meanings. Building on this, Welder introduced a highly original conception of the superego, which in his view is much more than a moral agency, as it allows one to objectify oneself and thereby to transcend one's self. Due to this formal function, the superego represents the capacity to abstract from one's own point of view. From this, Welder concluded that it is the formal function of the superego which constitutes the domain of the human, as it marks the essential difference to the animal world. At the 13th Congress of the IPA in Lucerne 1934, he elaborated his view by outlining the problem of freedom in psychoanalysis. In this presentation, he emphasized the connection between the establishment of the formal function of the superego and the advent of language, an argument he should repeat in his comment on Joan Riviere's paper. To justify this connection, Welder not only built on a psychoanalytic but also on a semiotic argument, claiming that in contrast to human language, in animal language, a dimension is missing and lacking. It is this dimension and only this dimension which is missing in the animal world. What animals lack is precisely the representational function of language, as they only dispose of the expressing and the appealing function. They can express moods and appeal to fellows, but they cannot deal with self-representation. Putting this forward, Welder leaned on the work of Carl Butler, and especially on his work on his organal model of language and communication. So who the hell was Carl Butler? Carl Butler was a physician and a psychologist and a language researcher who from 1922 until his forced emigration in 1938 taught as a professor at the University in Vienna. An intellectual celebrity at the time, his seminar at the university was as popular as Goldstein's in Frankfurt. According to his wife, Charlotte Butler, herself an authority in child psychology, Heinz Hartmann and many other psychoanalysts, Rudolf Eckstein, Friedrich Hacker, Paul Lazarsfeld, and others, and also many psychologists like Marie Hoda, Lotte Schenk, received their basic psychological knowledge in his introductory course on psychology. Although they usually did not mingle, Freudians and non-Freudians not only met in his seminar at the university, but also at the Psychological Institute he and his wife had founded. Taking this into consideration, it would have been almost impossible for the young Fuchs not to take notice of the works of the two Bühlers, Charlotte's on transitivism in small children and Carl's on crisis of psychology, and more so on language and communication. Apart from being a well-known, renowned Gestalt psychologist, Butler was also a language researcher whose so-called organon model of language and communication even today is still standard in any course on linguistics. Derived from Plato's dialogue Kratilos, language, according to Butler, is an organon, a tool for the one to inform the other of something about the things. That is a quotation from Plato. For Butler, this tool was essentially threefold, founded on three elementary relational functions: the expressive function, with regard to the current state of the mind of the sender, and the appealing function, calling on the receiver, and last, the representational function to signify the objects or state of affairs subjected to linguistic communication. Together, these functions constituted what Butler in his theory of language termed as the speech situation, which actually anticipated Austin's later notion of speech situation. Building on this, he argued that the language phenomenon acts as a mediator between the individuals who are involved in a semiotically consolidated process of communication. Butler's organon model is important insofar it influenced academic disciplines beyond the theory of language. For instance, as we have seen, psychoanalysis, but also contemporary philosophy, for instance, Ernst Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic forms. Discussing Butler's three symbolic functions of expression, representation, and significance, Cassirer acknowledged to have borrowed from Butler the notion of the representational function from his theory of language, as it allows to represent an objective fact in language and thus to fix it intersubjectively. Without mentioning Cassirer, Fuchs referred to this in his reflections on objective and subjective experience. Referring to the city of Paris, he asked, how then do we form the notion of an independent reality? And he responds, with the help of words, we can thus make statements about Paris that thus independently of any of us individually. Moreover, drawing from their joint study of brain-injured patients undertaken in the 1920s with his cousin, the neurologist Kurt Goldstein, Cassirer as a philosopher concluded that patients suffering from aphasia, agnosia, or apraxia are afflicted by a special symbol pathology. Due to the impairment of the representational function, they lost their capacity to flexibly respond to the challenges of everyday life. No longer able to abstract from the concrete situation they are facing, they just react to it by concrete behavior. Although he wasn't included in the cooperation between the two cousins, Fuchs, as Goldstein's assistants at the time, had certainly heard about it. This is confirmed by the fact that in basically all of the scientific arguments put forward by Butler, Cassirer, and Goldstein are at least mentioned in his group analytic writings, most notably in the review he wrote on Goldstein's first book. In this review, he not only confirmed that patients suffering from amnesia and aphasia have lost the representational function of speech, but also affirmed Welder's reflections on the superego when he said that quite generally such patients have lost the capacity to see themselves vis-à-vis an object, the world, and thus are unable to go beyond themselves. However, we may wonder whether and how these findings from neurobiology, linguistics, and philosophy are relevant for and related to the subject of mass psychology. For this, Welder's paper on the etiology and cause of mass psychosis that was originally presented in French to the Institute of the League of Nations in autumn 1934 is instructive. Although written 5 years before the outbreak of the Second World War and 1 year after Hitler's rise to power in Germany, it clearly anticipated what was to come soon. Whereas Freud, in his analysis of mass psychology, had focused on the libidinal structure of groups, Welder's focus was more balanced, as he likewise emphasized the importance of aggression and its disinhibition for the etiology and the cause of mass psychosis. Acknowledging that the concept of a mass psychosis is a difficult one and somewhat contradictory, because considered individually, psychosis is characterized by a disordered contact with other people and usually associated with an isolation from the community. Welder argued that this does not apply to the members of a mass. Therefore, he maintained that people participating in a mass are not psychotic in any psychiatric sense. On the contrary, they are more or less normal. However, this is not true with regard to the contents of the mass psychosis. These ideas and ideals, he argued, are inaccessible by logical arguments and incorrectable by the facts. They are delusional and thus betray a breakdown of reality testing on a collective level. Although this state of mind is comparable to individual psychosis, it differs with regard to its origins. Scrutinizing the psychological reasons for the collective loss of reality testing, Welder identified 2 other main factors. One is the Führer situation, where the individual superego is projected outside, just as Freud had assumed. However, leaning on his own refined review of the superego, he suggested that due to the mass situation, the formal function of the superego becomes invalidated, as is the individual's capacity to observe itself. As a consequence of this, reality becomes blurred and reality testing impaired or impossible. Moreover, Welder also assumed that due to the mass situation, the normally ambivalent relationships between the members of a community become sharply polarized, a polarization that eventually leads to a total splitting between eros and aggression. Consequently, all the love is reserved for their or its members and the hate directed towards the outsiders. This is why in the course of a mass psychosis, an aggressive storm is unleashed, which may take several routes. It may either be inhibited before becoming really destructive, or it may be acted out blindly and brutally in a rush of destruction, or it may turn against the mass itself and its members, causing guilt, remorse, and strivings for reparation. Evidently, Welder's analysis of mass psychosis and its impact on the individual undoubtedly extended and deepened Freud's original comprehension of mass psychology. However, although he even mentioned asymbolia as a clinical category, Welder in his paper somehow stops short to relate the dynamic of mass psychosis to the collective symbol pathology it is associated with. Therefore, it is interesting to compare his paper with Cassira's advanced analysis of myth and mythical thinking, as it is outlined in his last book on the myth of the state. Between 1941 and 1944, Cassira turned from a philosophy of symbolic forms to anthropology and eventually also to social philosophy with ethical elements. Taking this turn, he supplemented his previous view of myth as the mother soil of all symbolic forms by an analysis of the function of myth for the community. Building on the anthropological studies of Malinowski, namely on myth and primitive society, he adopted the latter's view that mythical thinking takes over when rational reasoning fails. This regularly happens in times of crisis, when people are faced with a task that is going on beyond their natural forces. Only then is common sense is suspended in favor of magic and myth. According to Carl Schmitt, a German law scholar in the Republic of Weimar, this is a situation when a society finds itself in a state of exception. That is, a state that psychologically speaking can be understood with Hopper as one of collectively failed dependency. However, Cassirer went further than this, arguing that mythical thinking is not only a feature of rigidly regulated tribal collectives on remote islands. He demonstrated that it is very much alive and at work within modern society dominated by technology. One can find that in this society, myth is systematically planned and produced by technical means. Therefore, far from being natural, the modern narratives of myth, the modern political myths are technically fabricated, strategically calculated, and effectively disseminated constructions. Playing on the title of Benjamin's famous essay on the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproduction, we can thus speak of myth as a mechanically reproduced construct. Cassirer's philosophical analysis of these manufactured myths rests on two basic arguments. Firstly, he prolonged his early work on individual symbol pathology to the collective level. And secondly, his view that myth is intrinsically related to ritual and ritualization. Combining both, he deconstructs the technologically informed myth of the state, namely that of Hitler's National Socialism, but not only, by pointing out that Nazi Germany was a society in which the elaboration and the interpretation of symbols was blocked. Due to this, a flexible symbolic interpretation of reality was foreclosed and thus no longer possible. Differentiating the ritual from the epic element of myth, he also assumed that under these conditions, language and communication become increasingly impoverished and turned into dogma, cliché, and prophecy. Simultaneously, they also become increasingly ritualized and even substituted by calculated ritualizations, for instance, in the form of repetitive gestures or endless parades or other calculated mass events. A companion to the dialectic of enlightenment written by Adorno and Horkheimer, Cassirer's book on the myth of the state explored the catastrophic side of modern culture and civilization. Not surprisingly, it ended on a skeptical note regarding the power of philosophy. According to Cassirer, it is beyond the power of philosophy to destroy the political myths, which are, in a sense, invulnerable, as they are impervious to rational arguments and thus cannot be refuted by syllogisms. However, he added, philosophy can make us understand the adversary. In order to fight an enemy, we must know him. In order to conclude, in his postscript to the paper on mass psychology, Freud indicated to have only brought his inquiry to a provisional end. And although he clarified a number of psychoanalytic side paths left unaddressed in the original paper, It is Cassire's study of myth which gives us a clue why it remains provisional. What Freud and other previous thinkers of mass psychology like Gustave Le Bon and Gabriel Tarde could not yet envisage was that modern masses are not natural at all, as they are mobilized by fabricated political myths, fake news. The originality of Cassire's approach was to understand mass psychology in terms of a collective symbol pathology as a necessary supplement to its psychodynamic understanding. Thank you for your attention.
Now I think that we can open our microphones. Now let's see if there's an echo. Oh, it disappeared. So that's it. If you want a few minutes of break, it will be good, but I think that we have questions. People might have questions and answers, and I really would like to see what people would ask. Personally, I'm so fed of new ideas and thinking that I would like to listen to questions. Thank you very much for you both. Dieter and Stephen. So who wants to make some questions?